Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then, in dreaming, the clouds methought would open, and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are going to be looking at William Shakespeare's play, The Tempest.
And we're on location.
I was on a ship today, taking a ferry from Boston out to Cape Cod. The weather was very calm, so it was completely inappropriate to this episode. But
there was water.
There was water. There was quite a lot of water. Would you say that Cape Cod is a magical space? Are we surrounded by spirits?
Well, it is an eerie place in some ways, and I can imagine believing that the supernatural was around you, so maybe we can come back to that a little later on.
All right, well, we'll see. If you hear any weird noises in the background, it's probably just spirits mucking about. We also have some big news. You, Suzanne, have published a book.
Yeah, a co-edited volume with Caitlin Heller called How We Read. And it's a collection of 13 essays where people talk about their experience of reading in ways that are sometimes very personal, very individual, but also overlap in curious ways.
Now, I also have an essay in this book where I talk about my history and sometimes struggles with reading. A lot of the essays are actually about people's difficulties when their understanding of themselves as a voracious reader is challenged when something in their life takes that away from them for a bit.
Well, that's exactly the point. I mean, that's the fascinating thing, that I think for every one of the contributors of the essays in How We Read, every one of them is somebody who understood themselves, not just as a good reader, but as somebody who loved reading. And virtually every one of the contributors talks about a time when that no longer was easy, when there were obstacles. And like kind of working through that, it's very private, right? It's very personal. But also when you see how the experience of others overlaps with your own in some ways, it makes you, feel a little bit different about how that felt for you.
And one of the other great things about this essay collection is that while you can go and buy it as a physical book, the PDF of it is available free from the publisher, Punctum Books. The essays are short and lively and delightful. Except for mine. Mine is terrible, but that's okay. And another big piece of news is that this episode will be coming out a few days after the 200th birthday of Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. And you wrote a little something to sort of think about that and celebrate it.
I did, and it's totally your fault. Chris said to me, Herman Melville's birthday is coming. Do you have any thoughts? Could you write something? And I'm like, sure. And then for 2 days after that, I was sort of slapping myself for having said yes. But something came out of it, and I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So that essay will be appearing on LitHub, and we will have another link to that in the show notes, and you should check that out as well. And happy birthday, Herman Melville.
Happy birthday.
But today we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare. Now, for those of you who don't know William Shakespeare, I mean...
I know, it's just ridiculous, right? I mean, how do you contextualize Shakespeare? Because for a lot of people, Shakespeare is almost like a synonym for not just English literature, but literature. When people are criticizing, the deterioration of standards in the schools or something like that, they're like, but Shakespeare, right? And I find that, I find that it puts us in a really weird position when we want to talk about him. On the one hand, I really like a lot of the plays. They're beautiful passages. I have a lot of feelings about them. But at the same time, it's like inescapable. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that.
Yeah, and I also feel sometimes a bit weird if we just gloss over who Shakespeare was, if we treat him that differently than we treat other authors just because he is more famous, and you've probably studied him more in school than you might have studied Christine de Pizan. Like, that just seems weird. It seems like we're treating him...
Yeah, we're like subscribing to that exceptionality.
Yeah.
But at the same time, not talking about it, like you said, it sticks out as being weird that we don't talk about it. But also, I don't know if you've noticed this, but increasingly, I find people subscribing to the conspiracy theory that like Shakespeare was not really Shakespeare. This whole conspiracy theory thing has like reemerged in the last, decade or so. And I don't even know what to make of that. And it shows up in the schools and it shows up in all kinds of odd places. Just today, I discovered that Keanu Reeves even believes in the conspiracy theory. I mean, if Keanu is believing in it, what is left for us?
His textual scholarship is impeccable.
I totally agree. And so I don't know what to do with this, right? So do we contextualize Shakespeare? Do we not contextualize Shakespeare? And what does it mean that this is a question for us?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we think about the canonical writers as the ones you don't have to contextualize. That is what it is to be in the canon.
Because everybody knows.
Yeah.
And also, like, why is it that Shakespeare inhabits that position? I mean, this is something obviously we don't have to like try to work out today. It might be something we come back to in another conversation. But like, first of all, why does he sit in that position? And is it a problem that he sits in that position? Does it have to do with the fact that his English is English that is far enough away from our own that you have to kind of make an effort to make sense of it? You have to think about it. It has to be taught in schools in a certain kind of way. But it's also present and accessible. Right? I mean, is that what it is? Is it the time that it sits in? Or is it what people say about, oh, he has this incredibly fertile vocabulary and changed the English language? Is that why he's seen as singular? Or is it just sometimes you get a sense that people say, oh, well, he represents all different kinds of human beings, a real spectrum of, personalities in terms of class, in terms of kinds of people. He's universal, right? I mean, I have profound distrust of that kind of way of situating him, but I don't know what to put in its place.
Well, I guess we're going to leave it aside for now, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about The Tempest within Shakespeare's life, just in case people are listening to this who haven't read The Tempest and still decided to listen anyway. Thank you.
Because it is quite an unusual one among his plays, isn't it? I mean, it feels really different. It's actually my favorite one of his plays.
Really?
Yeah. And I was thinking about why is that? Because it's very idiosyncratic. It's short. It's pretty tight. Two of the acts actually are just made up of one single scene, which is very bizarre, right? So it's got a very odd, very simple kind of structure. And it's like not much happens, right? I mean, things sort of happen, things get resolved, but how can I put it? The action is so different from many of the other plays where you really have a sense of people coming together, things changing, their circumstances changing, but also them changing as individual human beings. You don't get the sense in The Tempest that anybody changes at all. It almost feels all like one big performance, like a show within a show or something like that. I can't put my finger on it, but it feels totally different. But it's got some of the most beautiful poetry, I think, not just of his plays, but like anywhere in literature of the period.
Well, that's an interesting comment. Do you think that it feels more, shall we say, artificial or literary in the way that people sometimes mean in that sense and not realist?
Yeah. Well, artificial, I think absolutely in a way that I don't mean as a pejorative. Like, I don't mean that it's artificial, therefore bad. I mean that it's really interested in artificiality, like how art works, what it means to be a creator as a human being, like to create an illusion, to create an impression, to create a set of circumstances, like art in that sense. So it's artificial in the sense that it's totally preoccupied with how you make a world around you. And I find that kind of fascinating, especially because that invites us to think about two things that arise from this artificial world. First of all, illusion, like to what extent is what we see real and to what extent is it an illusion? And then the other aspect that it raises for us, I think, is power, right? So if you have the ability to create artifice, to make something artificial, right? To create in the world, what does it say about you? Like, are you powerful if you're a creator in that sense? Or is it just, this pitiful kind of imitation of like natural power or, divine power even, right? So I find that aspect of the play really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, let me do a little plot summary just in case there are listeners who haven't read it or haven't read it recently. So the play begins in confusion. We've got a ship at sea. There's a storm. There's tremendous effort trying to just stay alive. And that's the whole first scene. It almost doesn't make sense. It's almost incoherent. Mm-hmm. Cut to, so to speak, Miranda, who's a young woman, about 15, accusing her father Prospero of having caused the storm, which he totally did, and asking him to make sure no one on the ship was harmed, which they weren't. That was never his plan. And then we get a tremendous amount of exposition. So 12 years earlier, Prospero was the Duke of Milan, or Milan, but it's Milan apparently in the tradition. But then, perhaps like Victor Frankenstein, he got a bit too interested in the dark arts of book learning. So he left a space for his brother Antonio to ally with the King of Naples, to usurp the dukedom, and to put Prospero and his young daughter in exile. Prospero then spends his exile on an island which seems to be infused with magic and spirits, and he studies his books, and he takes control of the local spirits, and in particular, one powerful spirit named Ariel. The only person who's on the island when they arrive is Caliban, the son of the witch Sycorax, and Prospero promptly enslaves Caliban. Anyway, after all these 12 years, Prospero gets an unlikely opportunity. The King of Naples and his entourage, including Antonio the Usurper, are sailing back from Tunis, where the king's daughter has just been married, and they're going to sail right past his island. and they're ready to be trapped by a storm, which obviously Prospero has just whipped up. And so we find 3 different groups of characters, which the play follows in different scenes. First group has the king's son, Ferdinand. He lands on his own, and he thinks the king and everybody else is drowned. He runs into Miranda, Prospero's young daughter. They very quickly fall in love and very quickly get married. Second group is the king, who wakes up with most of the nobles from the ship. He thinks his son has drowned, and the king's brother, Sebastian, plots with that usurper duke, the brother of Prospero, to kill the king and take the crown. Third group, some of the lesser members of the king's entourage, separate from everybody else, get washed up with the alcohol. They get drunk. They run across Caliban and give him a taste of it. He immediately swears his loyalty to the drunk and tries to get them to kill Prospero so that they can be his master now. Well, so a bunch of hijinks ensue from all these different groups, but nobody ends up getting killed. And eventually Prospero brings everybody together, reveals everything, forgives basically everyone, gives up his magic, drowns his books of learning, restores his dukedom, and everybody goes home safe and happy, more or less. The end.
It seems like a lot happened.
It does, but one of the interesting things is that nobody really changes. And while there are hijinks that ensue, they don't develop the way that you might expect in some other plays, in some other Shakespeare plays. You have one attempt at the life of the king from Sebastian, and he doesn't come back to finish the deed, and it's really never brought up again.
No. And also, even though there are a couple of moments where it seems as though Prospero seems to change his mind or seems to be in doubt about something, by and large, he seems to be in control throughout the whole play. And that, how can I put it? That's interesting in some ways, but it also makes a certain kind of, not exactly a lack of tension, but a very steady tension. We're always aware of him holding the strings. He's always holding the strings. Like he might drop one a little bit, but he's always holding them. And that, is fascinating in some ways, but it's very peculiar as well.
Yeah. He has chances of changing his affect. When he first meets Ferdinand, he is very mean and rough
but
to Ferdinand.
It's clearly purposeful.
Yeah, it's a test. It's just to make sure that Ferdinand is good enough, or to show Miranda that Ferdinand is good enough. Like he's going to get these two together. That is part of the whole plot here.
Yeah, it's performative. It's performative if he's being mean to Ferdinand. It's performative too when he's giving all that exposition to Miranda. He's very purposeful and like, now's the time. This is the point when I'm going to finally tell you all this backstory. She says, I would often ask you about, where we came from and so on. And you would always say, not yet. And he's like, well, the minute's now come. Right. So he's holding those strings even at the very outset in the first scene that we see him in. One of the things that struck me when you were giving the summary of the play is the extent to which, and it's something I'd never thought about before, even though I've taught this play so many times, is the extent to which, they're on this island, which does something strange in spatial terms, right? In 2 different ways. Like, first of all, they're on this island, so they're isolated, they're away from other people. It's a place where it's like, I don't know, it's like a lab, right? To use your Frankenstein, analogy again. It's a place where Prospero can isolate this little group of people from everyone else. He can bring them together, manage them, control them, make them do what he wants. But it's also a space where this isolated group is divided up. It's almost like 3 rooms, right? He's got Ferdinand and that whole scene with Miranda going on over here. He's got the situation with his brother and the king over here. And the lesser players are off with Caliban much of the time. And so it's how can I put it? It's isolated and yet divided. It's a very strange space that these people inhabit.
It's interesting also that this is all taking place on an island, and an island that is specifically designed to have kept Prospero and Miranda isolated from everyone else.
Yeah, well, they were, as you say, exiled, but set adrift, right? Set adrift in a way that might have led to their death, right? To their demise, being like sort of dashed on the rock somewhere, right? But fortunately, or at least through the generousness of Gonzalo, as Prospero tells Miranda, they had some supplies, they had some things to keep them going, and then they fortuitously came to this island.
But the island has both separated Prospero from the other nobles back in Milan and back in Naples. It also provides the means by which he's going to encounter them again. So it's connecting them and separating them at the same time. And then when they land on the island, these 3 groups are also kept separately. They're all in their own little islands, their own bubbles.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And yet they're still in a space which they can be brought together.
Yeah, it's almost like more of an archipelago than an island in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think one of the ways I mean, I guess I've been thinking about this a lot, but about how water is being used in these books that we're looking at. But it is both a force of isolation and a force of connection.
That's right.
And in different ways at different times for people, but really carrying both of those meanings at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that I find really interesting in terms of, I mean, this is going to sound silly, but like the human condition, right? This idea that we are all individuals, we're all isolated from each other, but at the same time, we're connected to each other. And like, that's going far too big for this particular moment, I suppose. But it's just one of the metaphors of water and ocean in particular that I've been thinking about with Moby Dick, with Virginia Woolf, and now with Shakespeare.
Yeah, and then we're going to go on to the Odyssey, right? That whole question is going to play out again in slightly different kinds of ways. Yeah, as you're saying that, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the opening scene that you talked about a little bit earlier, the way in which we're in this chaotic environment where the mariners are trying to keep the boat from getting dashed on the shoals of this island. There's kind of panic, there's noise, and there's lots of water, right? And water is not just the environment that the boat is traveling through. Water is everywhere. Like, you know how when you're in a big storm, right? It's not like the rain comes down in this like sort of, harmonious kind of way, right? The wind dashes it. So the water strikes you in the face, or it even gets sort of swept upward. Like the air is full of water. And so that opening scene is doing something very strange in terms of the power of water to divide and connect, right? It's like, I don't know, a door or something like that, or a space that you cross through. And the space that they end up on is not just the island, but it's these divided spaces. So it's a strange play. It's so different, I think, from any of the others in that sense.
I certainly can't think of any other Shakespeare play, and I'm no expert, but I can't think of any other that begins with such noise. That first scene is really striking. And you don't necessarily get this if you just read it on the page, where it's just a bunch of confused lines and characters that you don't know. In all the performances I've encountered of it, it is just people yelling, and lines are indistinct, and several people yelling at the same time, and it's just this overwhelming chaos. Everything is out of order.
Yeah, well, that you put your finger on it, right? Because one of the ways in which that opening scene is incredibly powerful is you have this chaotic environment that then is going to be dispelled in Act 1, Scene 2, when we have Prospero talking to Miranda, and it's highly, highly, highly orderly. I don't know if you remember, but there's all this people come on, people go off, right? So it starts off where Prospero is talking to Miranda, and then she's like, oh God, I'm so sleepy. She falls asleep. But it's because he's put her to sleep so that Ariel can come in and Prospero can talk to Ariel, set up some plans, send Ariel off, and then get back to Miranda. So it's not just orchestrated, it's tremendously controlled. It's really tightly controlled. And that tight control of Act 1, Scene 2, how can I put it? It feels tighter and it feels more controlled and it feels more orderly, exactly because we had that chaotic scene of the shipboard. So it's a very simple play in some ways, but that simplicity on the surface kind of masks this complicated stuff that's all happening underneath. I guess maybe that's part of the fascination of it.
Yeah, and that just feels like a very unusual, again, for Shakespeare, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a Shakespearean. Shakespeareans are going to be listening to this, and they're going to be like, no. I mean, please write in. But that's that mode of doing the chaotic first scene and following it up with this incredibly orderly scene, which absolutely is laying out the orderly history. And it's all about Prospero's cunningly devised plan that's going to unfold very specifically, that he's in complete control of, and which indeed, more or less, goes off without a hitch. That's the tension that these two scenes are bringing out, that we're looking at, and it's not being done so much through the plot as through this contrast of here's one type of scene and here's another,
and they're unified in this really profound way with regard to time. Right. So one of the things that's really cool about Act 1, Scene 2 is the way in which Prospero is constantly talking about how it's time. He's like, he's very like, 'tis time. Thou must now no farther, he says to her. The hour is now come, right? The very minute bids thee ope thine ear. Like over that whole, first couple hundred lines, that kind of language that's, it's now, it's time, reminds us that something's changed. Right. And what's changed is this opportunity that he's got to try to straighten everything out because of this, boat passing by that he's able to pull in. And the chaotic scene of the opening, the Tempest, is also something we have to understand in terms of time. Like the very word tempest comes from tempus, like time, right? Referring to the time of year when storms take place, right? And so it makes us think about like cycles of time, the annual period of the year when storms take place. And also, how can I put this? When we talk about time, we'll say something like, what time is it? Oh, it's 3:00. But I might also say, like, say I'm expecting a baby, right? And I'm like, it's time, right? Like in other words, we use that kind of language of time in very different ways. And the changes are getting kind of rung on that in these opening scenes because the Tempest looks like a natural phenomenon, right? It looks like, oh, a storm blew up, but it's not. Prospero's like made this storm because it was time.
The other weird thing about time in this play is that, as far as I know, this is the only one of Shakespeare's plays that doesn't quite happen in real time, but it's very close.
I know, isn't that weird?
The events of the play take place over 3 hours.
Yeah.
And the play takes about 2 hours and change to read or perform.
Yeah, I think people sometimes don't realize how incredibly bizarre that is because normally, right, whether it's a play or it's a movie, right, it takes place over a longer period. It's all being compressed. Moments are being selected. But here we're in, so to speak, real time, which is so weird because the play is so artificial. Right?
Yeah. And then you've got that sort of pun of it's the Tempest, but it's also the Tempus. I mean, which, as you said, are etymologically related. But he's really drawing attention to the fact that this is a play also about time, and he's going to be deploying it in a weird, contextually weird theatrical way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And very purposely, I think, drawing our attention to this question of like time, what it means to say it's time in that Act 1, Scene 2 with Prospero and Miranda, and also right at the end of the play in the last two acts, really, where this whole question of it's time for something to happen, that comes up over and over again as well.
By that, do you mean in terms of, the characters all finally coming together and everything being revealed and everything being...
Well, actually, I think he really bangs you over the head with it, but in very beautiful language at the opening of Act 5, right? I mean, this is the opening words of Act 5. Prospero is there and he says, "Now does my project gather to a head. My charms crack not, my spirits obey, and time goes upright with his carriage. How's the day?" He says to Ariel, which literally means, what time is it? Right? And so it's a great moment because it's both of those senses of time, right? Like, what time is it? It's like 6 o'clock or 3 o'clock or whatever. And also now, right? Like right now, right? And I find that so enchanting, this like playing with a phenomenon that's like so everyday, like who doesn't understand time, right? But also time is weird, right? And so I feel like this play is really, I don't know, unpacking that for us in a really very cool way.
One of the other interesting time-ish things about this play is that it also contains quite a lot of songs.
Yeah.
The action, such as it is, just breaks occasionally, and usually Ariel, but not always.
Yeah.
Usually Ariel will sing these lyric songs.
Quite lovely ones.
They're very lovely lyrics, and some of the music I've heard them set to can be quite lovely. And they're also sort of out of time. They're these pastoral lyrics. I mean, one of the most famous ones, earliest one, Full Fathom 5.
Thy father lies.
Ariel sings this to Ferdinand, the king's son, as he's on his way to Miranda and worrying about his father, who he thinks is drowned, and sings, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Ding dong, hark now I hear them, ding dong bell."
It's so weird. It's like a nursery rhyme, right? It's like a child's nursery rhyme, but it's also like a spell or something. It's so beautiful.
It is like a nursery rhyme, especially in that we're no longer in pentameter.
No.
We're in a ballad, in a 4-beat line. Mm-hmm. I also find this particularly lovely because most of the lines are full of, there's a lot of Fs, there's a lot of S's, there's a lot of sh and ch. And it's these very oceanic sounds, right? "Full fathom 5 thy father lies." And it just goes on, except when we're talking about the bones. There's a really lovely mirroring of these oceanic sea coming in and out sounds with the poetry here.
Yeah. And what does that do to, like, again, our sense of time, right? You were mentioning that song does something disruptive and odd to our sense of time. The change from the pentameter line into the ballad, that does something. Like, what's the effect of these songs?
And the effect of the sea on the human body as it slowly transforms into coral, let's say, or something like it.
Only not really, right? Because none of this has happened.
No, he's not dead.
No, it's an illusion.
It's all absolutely an illusion. So this image is out of time as well. Yeah, it's very strange. I guess we're going to keep saying that, but it's a very strange play.
But also beautiful. I mean, those lines that you read, I think, are incredibly evocative, the lines on the song, but also so many of the passages. And one of the things I find kind of striking about it is, how can I put it? Some of the most beautiful language is Prospero's. It's often very strong language, very assertive, very powerful language. But the most beautiful poetry interestingly, I think is often Caliban's. That's my sense of it anyways. I mean, they're the lines we use in the cold open, and some of the other passages where he's speaking also really just, the language is, how can I put it?
Well, do you have an example?
Yeah, I have a good example. It starts out angry, where Caliban is cursing Prospero. He's so angry about the ways in which Prospero has kind of taken advantage of him, manipulated him, taken him for granted, enslaved him. And he says this. He says, all the infections that the sun sucks up from bogs, fens, flats on Prospero fall and make him by inch meal a disease. His spirits hear me, and yet I needs must curse. But they on their pinch, fright me with urchin shows, pitch me in the mire. And he goes on, right, about this. And he says this. For every trifle are they set upon me, sometimes like apes that mow and chatter at me and after bite me, then like hedgehogs which lie tumbling in my barefoot way and mount their pricks at my footfall. Sometime am I all wound with adders, who with cloven tongues do hiss me into madness. Right? It's a very dark passage. It's not like those, the island is full of noises, these extraordinary sounds, don't be afraid of them. I mean, this is almost like the dark side of that passage. It's also poetic in a very comparable way, but this is about the terrors of the island, the terrors that Prospero kind of visits through the creatures of the island on Caliban, right? Sometime am I all wound with adders that do hiss me into madness. So I don't know what to do with that line, but it's beautiful, right? And I think he has these lines, right? Which is weird because he's supposed to be savage, subhuman, a slave, right? But there's something else there.
The other part of that passage, which you just read out, which struck me, and I hate to beat a dead horse about this, but he uses the line that these infections the sun sucks up from bogs, fens, flats, and you see where I'm going with this.
On Prospero Fall, yeah.
Well, but it's very much like Milton. It's very much like that passage I keep bringing up.
Oh, yeah.
Rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens, and shades of death.
You're right. That's so cool.
I don't know about any connection between these two texts, but obviously that line just jumped out at me as being very Miltonic.
He's super interested in Shakespeare, right?
And very appropriately so.
Well, is it a Miltonic line or is Milton like doing a Tempest thing there, right? We have to think about that again.
And how would Caliban fit into Paradise Lost?
Well, that's a question, right? But the other one is like, is there a certain vision of the natural world that we're seeing here? A vision of the natural world that's kind of elemental, these monosyllables, right? When you talk about the world in its early stages of creation, when you talk about this island that is on the one hand a place of tremendous artifice, right, and illusion and deception, but it's also quote unquote a primitive environment, right? Maybe those monosyllables are doing some of that kind of work, right?
It's interesting that you say that it's primitive environment, because I think many of those monosyllables in Milton, and I think I haven't looked this up because I just thought of it, but I think all three of the ones in Caliban's speech right there are all Anglo-Saxon, not Latinate.
Yes, I think you're right.
These are primitive in that sense as well. They are more belonging to the language. There's usually a sense these kinds of words often feel a bit more humble and part of the earth to a lot of Anglophone speakers. Yeah,
it's true. They create a very different feeling.
Which isn't to say, I mean, I don't know. I haven't gone through it. I don't think that Caliban is particularly using that vocabulary.
Well, but this again, as we're bringing this out, this impulse toward listing is something we see elsewhere in Caliban's speech as well. In the very first time we encounter him, this is Act 1, Scene 2. So it's later in the same scene that we were talking about earlier, where Prospero is with Miranda, kind of giving the backstory. Then Miranda goes to sleep and Prospero talks with Ariel. Then Ariel goes away. And Prospero has a conversation with Caliban, while Miranda is still there, but she's not really engaged in the conversation. And here, Caliban again uses this kind of listing, right? He says, when you first came, you made much of me. You were really nice to me. And he says, Caliban says, then I loved thee and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place and fertile. Cursed be I that it did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you, for I am all the subjects that you have. Right? So this like listiness when the island is being accounted for is maybe something that we see elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and of course, because Caliban is the person who, when Prospero arrived, Prospero taught Caliban language, but Caliban taught Prospero an inventory of everything that is wonderful and available on the island. Caliban knew the island perfectly well, and he was able to list out the encyclopedia of all the things you'll find here which he then offers to do again to Stefano, the drunkard, the comic relief guy that gets him drunk, that he's going to, but it's like, yeah, he owns this island in that sense that he knows it really well. He knows every detail, every rock in it. And he is seemingly all too willing to share that information with people. But part of that's because it is like the subject he is masterful over.
Well, they have a kind of an exchange, right? And what Caliban gives to Prospero is knowledge of the island, right? Like where to, find this food or this other kind of thing, and also physical service, right? He's becomes enslaved by Prospero. He brings in the wood, right? He does service, right? What Prospero gives him in exchange, right? It's a very unfair exchange, is mastery and language. And, that passage we were just talking about a moment ago in Act 1, Scene 2, a moment that I think really brings that out is where Caliban says, you taught me, he says, to name the bigger light and the less that burn by day and night, right?
Mm.
That's the sun and the moon. And it's such a funny moment, right? Because Caliban is talking about how Prospero taught him to name them, the sun and the moon, but he doesn't call them the sun and the moon, the greater light and the less, right? So it's a strange, how can I put, a strange in-between moment where Caliban is kind of gesturing toward the knowledge that Prospero has given him, but not actually using it. And it draws our attention to the exchange, right? It draws our attention to the fact of there was a transaction of some kind. And the fact that happens again with Stefano later on, it tells us that, we're seeing this exchange iterated again, right? It's happening over again. And it makes us ask, what's the ground of that exchange? What kind of transaction is this? And what's going to be the aftermath of this transaction? Because the service of Ariel and the service of Caliban is in some ways very comparable, in some ways totally different.
It's interesting because I could be wrong about this. My sense of it was that the exchange of language and information about the island happened first before the enslavement proper happened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking through that moment now, and I could be way off. This is just live thinking, but I'm getting the sense that Caliban offered this exchange with Prospero because he thought they were both equals, that they both had masters over a particular domain, and they were going to share this information with one another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then that got upended
mm-hmm.
when Prospero didn't think of them as equals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's that very passage. Caliban makes this explicit when he says, I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king, and here you sty me in this hard rock, while you keep from me the rest of the island. So for Caliban, they're on equal footing at some point, and then Prospero pulls that out from under him. And it becomes, I don't know, character, a relationship that is on the one hand deeply troublesome, right? It's a relationship of enslavement, but it's also almost like a weird family group. And that, I don't know, I find that aspect of it kind of disturbing on a whole nother level.
Yeah, well, that was one of the places I was hoping to go with this, because thinking about the relationship between Prospero and Caliban, and then also Prospero and Ariel, and then all the other relationships that come, they're all family relationships in a sense.
Well, in a sense, right? Because so Caliban is like in a family relation in some sense with Prospero, in the sense that he's kept in the same physical space, right? At the end of the play, Prospero's like, go back to my cell and wait for me there, right? So there's a sense in which he's in the interior spaces, right? He's within, but there's boundaries, there's borders, right? Where Prospero says, well, I was nice to you. I did treat you with humane care in mine own cell till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child, right? That is to enter into the family group a little too much, right? So like this question of being inside the family group and not inside the family group, that's the space that Caliban inhabits.
And he does it wrongly. But part of what I'm wondering now, and again, I feel like I'm just doing a different kind of conspiracy theory or headcanon with it, but was one of the problems with, there are lots of problems with Caliban approaching Miranda, if that's how we understand what's happened. That there's an attempted rape, or at least an attempted sexual congress that wasn't allowed, is one of the problems with that. The fact that they are basically brother and sister. Now that never gets teased out in any of the language, so maybe that's wildly off.
No, but I mean, you're right that language doesn't explicitly get brought out. Like Prospero never talks about Caliban, to the best of my memory, in like filial terms. Like that never happens. But they're all cohabiting, right? They're all living together, right? Ariel's there and not there. Ariel's there in the sense that Prospero has this relationship with Ariel. Ariel does things, but Ariel always remains engaged with Prospero and not with the others. Miranda doesn't know about Ariel. Caliban knows that there are spirits, but doesn't really understand or engage with them, right? The relationship of Ariel and Prospero is something that's private. The family group, so to speak, that's on that island until now, right? Until the Tempest, until it's time for things to change, is Prospero, Miranda, and Caliban, which is weird.
Well, over the course of the play, certainly Ariel is explicitly told not to be visible to anyone except Prospero, unless casting an illusion or something like that. I don't know whether that was always true beforehand. I don't remember if there's any detail about whether Miranda knows that Ariel exists.
I don't think so.
Yeah. And of course, Ariel is also not human.
That's right.
Where Caliban is.
Yeah.
Although that is called into doubt many times in the text.
Yeah. There's tons of places where language gets used that dehumanizes Caliban, right? That sees him as more animal than human or as not quite.
He's referred to as a fish. He's referred to as a moon calf. And his mother comes from Algiers.
Mm-hmm. North Africa.
So he is marked, I believe, in this text as being ethnically different, as being racially different in that sense. Although I'm sure it's more nuanced than that.
Well, it's super weird, right? Because, on the one hand, he's being marked out as being racially different in some sense. His mother is described as a sort of like witch-like character, this sort of, outcast witch-like character who comes from North Africa. But also, remember where the King of Naples has just been to marry off his daughter.
Yes.
Tunis, North Africa, right?
although many in his coterie do not approve of this terribly much. Like they make fun of her for that. Yeah. And one of the advantages of her being in Tunis, of course, is that she is so far away that she's being kept apart by a sea. Mm-hmm. And they vastly overestimate how long it would take for news to get to Tunis at one point. But okay, fine.
Well, the effect of that is to put us in this really weird kind of Mediterranean environment. And this, I think, is something we should tease apart a little bit, especially since we're in a, watery or oceanic cluster. Where are we here when we're at sea in The Tempest? On the one hand, we're clearly in the Mediterranean, right? These are Italian nobles, right? We're talking about Milan and Naples on the one hand, and North Africa, Tunis, and so on the other, right? So we're somewhere in the Mediterranean, right? We're on this island. But I don't want to go into detail about it, but when you look at the sort of the sources that Shakespeare was looking at, the kinds of things he was reading, the kinds of news that was coming from the New World, right, and colonization in what would become North America, there's also a kind of a Caribbean context for thinking about this. There's sources that relate to that part of the world that play into The Tempest, right? So when we're at sea, when we're in this oceanic environment, where are we? Is it a Mediterranean environment? Is it a Caribbean environment? Is every oceanic environment in some ways the same environment? And you know what I mean? In other words, there are particularities, right, to whether we're talking about the Mediterranean region or whether we're talking about the Caribbean, right? But is the state of being at sea, of being on the borderland of sea and shore, of being on an island, right? Is that in some sense always the same place? It's kind of uncanny, right? It's a place, but no place. It's a particular place and also no place. So those bits and pieces that we're talking about that allude to North Africa, on the one hand, they localize the action of the play and they kind of problematize for us this whole dichotomy that's being drawn between people who are not quite human or people who are alien or people who are other in some sense over here. I think it's all problematized by the fact that, on the one hand, that's where Sycorax comes from, but it's also where the King of Naples marries off his daughter. So there's a lot of specificity around that, but there's also this generic quality of being on the island. And I don't think that's unique to The Tempest. I think that's something we find in other works as well, right? To be on the island is to be in a particular place, but it's also to be in this kind of almost universal blank place, this cipher. I don't know, this is something we might think about more when we're talking about the Odyssey, but I think it's a very strange feature.
I think that's also something that we encountered at To the Lighthouse. One of the advantages of that being set on an island is it was able to carry some of that feeling, I thought, in terms of how these people were separate but connected to each other. The fact even that the island is exchanged from the sort of historical one that Virginia Woolf's family went to.
Well, they weren't really on an island, right? They were in Cornwall.
Well, that's true.
It's more of a promontory. In some ways that's a trivial distinction, right? Beachiness is beachiness, but only not, right? That's the thing about islands as opposed to even very remote spits of land, right? When you're cut off from other land, on the one hand, that's a trivial distinction, but on the other hand, it's huge.
Right.
Because you're cut off. I was thinking about this not so long ago. Like this is going to sound like a really trivial little comparison, but out here on the sort of outer Cape, like the far end of Cape Cod, occasionally there have been substantial enough storms that they started to break through between the ocean and the bay a little bit south of here, down in Truro and down in Wellfleet. And on the one hand, it's like, big deal. So maybe, it breaks through and we'll build a bridge. It'll be fine. They'll fix the road. But people are kind of freaked out about that, right? Like, way beyond the actual practical complications of having a bridge. Like, yeah, that would be cost, that would be inconvenience, it would like mess up people's insurance and stuff like that. But people are kind of freaked out by it. And so when we think about islands, I mean, I think that sense of isolation and being cut off, it's a very different space. And so it's really important. Like what I got here is it's really important that it's an island and not something else.
No, absolutely. That was also what I was trying to get at. Of course, it had to be an island where To the Lighthouse take place. It just had to be. So have you ever seen a performance of The Tempest?
I haven't. I've taught it many times, so I know it as a book and not as a play.
And you've never seen a movie? Have you never?
Well, I did see one thing, and this is like maybe a very bad representation of the play. Way back when, I guess it was the early 80s, there was a movie that was directed by, I think, Paul Mazursky that had John Cassavetes in it as Prospero, Gina Rowlands, Raul Julia as Caliban, Susan Sarandon as Ariel, and the infinite Molly Ringwald as Miranda. But it was a really interesting adaptation because it was not the play. It was kind of a modernization that was an adaptation of the play. And bizarrely, I remember really loving it. I remember being absolutely fascinated by it. And I haven't been able to watch it again recently, but like the reviews make it look like it was really a terrible movie. But I remember at the time being fascinated by it. And I think it was because it opened the door to, you could have a play of Shakespeare's in this case, and you could rework it. Like you could just redo it. I guess it was my first exposure to adaptation in a substantial way. Because I knew something about the play already. And then I saw it represented in this other way. And that kind of just blew my mind. So even if it wasn't a very good movie, it was a great entry into that whole question of what is an adaptation? What is it for? Like, what does it make you think about? Even if it's not a very good one, what does it do to you? So that's what I've seen.
Well, I have not seen that one. That sounds very interesting. Yeah. I had the very good fortune, I guess, to see The Tempest performed in New York in Shakespeare in the Park with Patrick Stewart as Prospero, which is, a treat. I've seen at least one movie adaptation of it, the not that great version that Julie Taymor did a few years ago. I've listened to an audiobook version, which is produced as a radio performance with Ian McKellen as Prospero.
Oh, I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, it was pretty good. So I guess I've encountered it a few times in performed state, which is, of course, a very different way of encountering any play than reading it on the page. But in some ways, this one maybe more so. I don't know. I mean, I guess, again, I always think of that very first scene, which is so different on the page than it is on the stage. And I'm wondering if you feel like, does this exist to you more as a text than it does as a performed piece?
For me, and this is probably very idiosyncratic, it exists only as a text.
Right.
And it's weird because in some ways I know it very well. Like I haven't taught it recently, but in the past I've taught it many times. So it's extremely familiar. Like I have a lot of the lines by heart, right? But as text, like as if it was, I don't know, a narrative poem or something, right? I mean, for me, that's what it is. And I'm not saying that's particularly good, but it's a strange fact that that's what it is for me.
So when you've read it and when you've taught it and thought about it, like in addition to that first scene, as we talked about the songs that come in, when you're seeing a performance of it, that slows the pace of the text way down for a bit, and music comes in, and there's music all over the place. Incidental music is mentioned all the time, and the musicality of it isn't reflected in the text. So, do you idle over Ariel's songs?
Well, there's actually, I love the songs, and I have this like imagined music in my head that goes with them when I'm reading it. So I kind of have a sense of the songs, but there's this one moment actually that's always very jarring for me. I find it both fascinating and also it's incredibly jarring for me. And I think it speaks to what you're just raising when near the end of Act 3, Prospero is kind of getting everybody under control, and he has Ariel run this kind of mask or dumb show, where Ariel appears as a harpy and there's a feast that appears and disappears, and it really, freaks out and terrifies the onlookers and so on. And so at the end of that, Prospero speaks to Ariel and says this: "Bravely the figure of this harpy hast thou performed, my Ariel, a grace it had devouring." If my instruction thou hast nothing bated in what thou hadst to say, so with good life and observation strange, my meaner ministers their several kinds have done. My high charms work, and these mine enemies are all knit up in their distractions. They are now in my power. And it's such a weird little passage because a whole bunch of stuff is going on there, right? At the end, everything's working. They're all in my power. Like, again, Prospero's holding the strings real tight. But bravely the figure of this harpy hast thou performed, a grace it had devouring. It kind of tells us that there was this weird, fantastical, kind of horrifying scene where Ariel was this monstrous figure devouring. And, when it's the book you're reading, when it's the words on the page, you don't see that, right? And it's like this, I don't know, like black hole kind of in the text always for me. Like I kind of almost see something terrible and terrifying, but not quite. And so I always feel like that bit, a grace it had devouring. I always read that. It gives me the creeps a little bit because I'm like, something was there, but it's not a thing I can see or that's apparent to me because it's something that has to be enacted and made visible. And I don't know if there's a performance or even, whether it's a play or a movie that does that in a persuasive kind of way because it's supposed to be awe-inspiring, right? And can the reality live up to the imagination of what that would be like?
It's also interesting, I think, that is a moment where in terms of the performativity, it's a kind of spectacle. It's that kind of performance rather than the development of a character. And there's lots of spectacle in this play.
Oh, yeah.
But as we've said, there's very little in terms of that kind of plot and character development. And nothing is ever really at stake. Nothing is ever.
Well, there's this one moment where Prospero seems to change his mind, but like I totally don't buy it. Yeah, I mean, it's Ariel's like, oh, they all look really sad. They're all really unhappy, and if you saw them, you would surely be moved. Ariel says, and Prospero's like, dost thou think so? And Ariel's like, well, if I could feel, I would feel bad for them. And Prospero's like, and so will I. Let's be nice to them, right? And he apparently changes his mind. But that's so out of character, right? It's so completely out of character from this figure who's pulled the strings, right? Who's managed everybody, who's controlled everybody from beginning to end. I totally don't buy this changing his mind. Like, I'm going to be nice now.
Well, but he does. He is nice at the end.
Yeah, but it serves him. It serves his
sure.
ends, right? It's like, Shakespeare is somebody who in, let's say, I don't know, Merchant of Venice, to raise a really problematic example, is really interested in pity and compassion and what that looks like for good or for evil, right? And Prospero in that moment is seemingly compassionate, but it's so cold-blooded. Anyway, it's an odd moment. In other words, you were saying that nobody changes, right? There's this moment where it looks like Prospero changes in the sense that he changes his mind. He's compassionate, right? But it's like hollow, right? You're so sensitive to the artificiality of what's happening that you're like, oh yeah, right? That's also artifice.
It's interesting. I agree that he's not actually changing his mind at all at that moment. But I do think about that ending and like, is he being nice? I mean, it feels like to me what's happening is that through this sort of moment of what seems like radical forgiveness of saying, my brother who usurped my throne, you're nothing. I'm not going to do anything bad to you. I totally could, but I'm not going to do anything bad to you. And everybody, none of you are going to have any real problems. And yet what ends up happening as a result of all this machination is that his daughter is going to be the Queen of Naples.
That's right.
It's not just that his title has been restored to him. It's that he is in an improved position as if he's been playing some, three-dimensional chess long game, right?
Absolutely.
Which he hasn't, but this moment has, as far as we can tell, he didn't.
You don't think so, man? I see that. I always see, well, I mean, who knows, right? I always see it as the long game. I mean, at the end of that play, when he's like, oh, I'm going to break my staff and drown my book and like, just be, poor dumb Prospero. I'm like, like it seems to me that he's just played out all these cards one after another, playing the long game, right? And even that one moment where he almost drops one of the strings, right? Where he's like, oh, I forgot to pay attention to this conspiracy of Caliban and, the other
comic relief.
The comic relief. That's the one moment I think where it seems like he's not lost control, but he's not holding one of those strings taut. And that's it. Like that is the one moment where I even get like the most remote impression that he's not totally in control.
Right.
And even then he like gets control of it really rapidly.
Fine.
It's absolutely fine. So all those moments that are like kind of seeming like, oh, I'm going to have compassion and pity on them. Oh, I'm going to like drown my book and break my staff. I'm like, I mean, that's how, I don't know. That's my sense of it. My sense is that this is about power and control from the beginning to the end.
One of the things that I was thinking about today was I was thinking about not what is Prospero's point with this, but what is Shakespeare's point, or what is this play doing? This play that has no plot. This play that has this scene where somebody is trying to kill his brother, the king, in order to take the role. And that only seems to exist because it kind of rhymes with what happened to Prospero, that there is no real threat of that happening, that there's no immediate sense of revenge or lesson learned from that. It just is brought up and then sort of dropped and never touched again. I guess I have two thoughts. First off, I'm thinking of The Tempest as perhaps a kind of closet drama, which is to say a play that is not meant to be performed. It's meant to be read and thought about. And so it acts as a kind of poem where you've got these different parts that are interesting because they're in contrast or comparison with each other. They're more like different stanzas or different movements in a symphony, but it's not quite what we expect of a play. But it is, I think, a closet drama that has to be performed because so much of this is brought out in turning it into a play, into actually, living through the acting that takes place over the same time period as the action of the play, of the way that the chaos scene at the beginning and the order scene that follows it, and the way that the music sort of slows down the pace of things, and then the spectacle picks it back up again, that this all does sort of need to be experienced as performed theater, but it is attempting something else. And what I think it's attempting to do is to bring all these things together to this final moment when everybody's in the room. I mean, that happens in a lot of Shakespeare plays where everybody's in the room at the end. But in this one in particular, it just feels like the whole point of the play is to get all these people into the room together. It reminded me of Mrs. Ramsay and her big banquet and getting all of her characters together as well.
Yeah. That's actually very neat. Yeah, because like you said, it's not uncommon in Shakespeare's plays to have sort of everybody gathered together at the end. What's peculiar here is that everybody's gathered together under the yoke of somebody who's on the stage. Yeah. And that's unusual relative to the other plays, but it's, as you say, very resonant with what's happening with Mrs. Ramsay. And you remember that description in To the Lighthouse where they're gathered around the dining table and, outside the windows, it's almost as though there's like this fantasy. It's almost like they're in a ship. Right? They're, again, cut off from the world, right? And there's this one person who's in control in some way or who is very gently holding the reins, right, in that room, right? And Prospero is, holding the strings in a slightly different kind of way, but there's a real analogy there. It'll be interesting to see if when we go into the Odyssey, if there's something comparable.
Well, I think that is just about all the time we have for this very time-centric play. I can't believe we've talked for 3 hours. The next text that we're going to be doing is Homer's Odyssey.
Yeah, which is going to be something of a return for us in some ways, appropriately, right? Because the very first text we did when we started this all out was the Iliad, right?
Yes. We're going to be looking at a very specific translation of it this time. Although Emily Wilson's recent translation. It's, it's lovely. Pick it up. Check it out. Obviously, if you have another edition more at hand and you want to read that, that's of course fine. But that is the one that we're going to be talking about in specific. So we'll have links to that in the show notes. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how a lot of these issues about wateriness and family relations and slaves and other things that have been coming up play out in the Odyssey. But if you'd like to get in touch with us or tell me why I'm wrong about what I think about Shakespeare, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We would always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/14. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Join us again at the Spouter-Inn.